snap. The kick is in the air, and the kick this time is no, sir-ree. No, sir-ree. Final score, Tennessee 20, Florida 17. Pandemonium reigns.
You're listening to the RTI Podcast, powered by WalkingTopInsider.com.
Hello, everybody, and welcome in to a special edition of the RTI Podcast. It's not going to be Ben McKee and I. It's just going to be me and Graham Hall of the Gainesville Sun. He's a Gators correspondent for the Gainesville Sun. I want to bring him on here to talk about everything Florida because obviously Tennessee plays number 9 Florida this weekend, and we've had Graham on the show, several different times to talk about Florida. He's kind of our go-to guy here to cover the Florida Gators, so I want to bring him on to talk everything about Florida, Kyle Trask, that defense, Dan Mullen, everything. So, Graham, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast this week.
Yeah, Nathaniel, thanks for having me. It's always good to be here. You do a great job, and always this time of year, third week, I feel like, or I guess the fourth week now for Florida. Mm-hmm. Always my pleasure being here with you and talking all things Gators in Tennessee.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that, Graham. Let's get right down to it because I have a lot of stuff I want to ask you here about Florida. So obviously over the weekend, you saw Florida come back and beat Kentucky, and that was spurred a lot really by what Kyle Trask was able to do on offense when he came in after Felipe Franks suffered that season-ending injury. Unfortunate news. I hate that for Franks. You never want to see, no matter what team they are, no matter who they are, you never want to see a guy go down with that type of injury, especially. But it did seem like from watching on the television and everything that when Trask got in there, it seemed like that offense, it started clicking better than it was under Franks. I'm curious, Graham, that's only the second time that Trask has really played a game. The only other time where he actually came in and had any kind of meaningful snaps in a game was last year against Missouri when Mullen pulled Franks in the second half of that game, and Trask came in and led him on a 75-yard scoring drive and then didn't really do a whole lot else after that. In your opinion, from what you all have been able to see and everything from Trask in that game, obviously I know you guys unfortunately don't get to see much, if anything at all, at practice and stuff now the season's going. It's kind of an SEC thing. There's not a lot of coaches let the media see a whole lot of practice. But from what you have been able to see in the games you've seen him play and from what you've seen him practice in the offseason and stuff, what is your confidence level in Kyle Trask, and what kind of quarterback do you think he is? Because I look at him and see a guy who's not necessarily the most athletic, but he seems to, from the limited time he's been out there, take care of the ball a decent amount. But I'm curious in your confidence level and his ability to lead the offense, and what do you make of him as a quarterback?
Yeah, a lot of really good points there. I think that Kyle Trask, the biggest thing that he brings the Gators is probably poise. The guy has been pushing Felipe Franks for the better part of probably 3 years now for that job since he got in the building. Kyle Trask is kind of the epitome of a consummate professional. Hasn't really started a game since he was a freshman in high school. Came to Florida, has played some backup time, but all reports of him in practice have always been extremely positive. You talk to people, and from what we've seen out there, a guy who's very accurate, gets the game plan, very intelligent on the field, more athletic than I think people think. He had that rushing touchdown against Kentucky. Dan Mullen likes using the term willing runner. As long as you're willing to put your body on the line, embrace the play call. You saw that play there where he takes a lot of contact and pitches it to LaMichael Pirine for the touchdown. That's really what Dan Mullen's going to look to do with Kyle Trask. I think the main reason why Felipe Franks was Florida's starter was because, especially with Dan Mullen's specialties on offense, he gave them a little bit higher ceiling on offense with his athletic ability, whether it was as a runner or his ability to have a downfield throw of 60-plus yards. Those are two things that Kyle Trask really kind of lags behind in. But every other area, when you're talking about fundamentals, footwork, accuracy, mental aspect, going through the progressions, knowing the play call, identifying the defense, that's a big one. And it's a big reason why Florida was able to have those 19 unanswered points in the fourth quarter when Kyle Trask came in there late in the third quarter. He's a very accurate quarterback. I would I don't want to jump to conclusions or definitely 100% say anything definitively, but from what we've seen and glimpses, and certainly what last Saturday showed, Kyle Trask has shown all indications that he is the more accurate quarterback than Felipe Franks, and that's definitely one of the reasons that he's ahead of Emory Jones. For those who aren't really in the know of Emory Jones's developmental process, the main reason he's not out here tearing it up as a redshirt freshman is that Florida has really worked consistently on retooling his throwing motion and developing him a little bit more physically so he can take the contact through 12, 13 games, although certainly he will. It's expected that he'll get in the game in some form or the other against the Volunteers on Saturday. But with Kyle Trask, as you saw, that's a guy who doesn't waver in his confidence. He's been waiting for this moment, very accurate. You saw him carve up that Kentucky secondary that had Yusuf Corker go down with that targeting penalty and was kind of really thin there in the secondary. Kyle Trask carved him up at a lot quicker rate than Felipe Franks was really able to. If he can do that against the Volunteers, which will obviously be contingent upon the run game, which I'm sure we're going to talk about here in a little bit. If Kyle Trask can go out there and do what he did for 15 minutes against the Wildcats, for 60 minutes or even 45 minutes against the Volunteers, Florida may have they may be on the same trajectory that they were at season-wise before Felipe Franks went down.
To me, the quarterback, there's a lot of intriguing storylines, in this game. I think there's a lot. We'll actually do an article on that either Wednesday or Thursday of this week, so either shortly after this podcast is out or a little bit later this week. But I think there are several storylines in this game to keep an eye on, and obviously one of the biggest ones, if not the biggest one, that national and regional and fans of both teams are watching is that the quarterback situation for the Gators. To me, Graham, I look at Trask and his, as you said, he's a more accurate type of guy than what Felipe Franks was. My co-host Ben McKee and I were talking earlier this week in our first podcast of the week that we both think, really, we feel a little less confident about Tennessee's chances of pulling the upset over Florida with Trask at quarterback, because Franks obviously has a higher ceiling, in my opinion, as far as big plays, but he also has a lower floor because he was a little more careless with the football. I mean, he has a propensity to just kind of throw interceptions and make kind of poor decisions. Trask, from what we've seen, he hasn't do that. Obviously, we've only seen him in 2 games, really, but I'm curious your thoughts on that, Graham, before I ask you more about Emory Jones here in a second. Do you think Tennessee's chances of pulling off that upset, do you think they've gone down with Trask at quarterback, or do you think they actually were higher with Franks as a quarterback?
I think you could certainly make that argument that Tennessee's chances have gone down if Florida's quarterback really is more accurate and less prone to turnovers than Felipe Franks was. I mean, you remember that 4 turnover performance in the season opener for Franks. He has made some wild throws in the past, thrown into double coverage. He has a tendency to zero in on receivers. He has a tendency to decide who he's going to throw to before the play call. At least he did more so in the past than as of late. That certainly is an argument you could make if you're a Florida fan looking for an optimistic viewpoint, but I think most people have it pegged accurately that this is a starting quarterback who is going to have to adjust to some things throughout the course of the game. We haven't really seen him deal with several factors that he may necessarily be used to dealing with, like fatigue. That's a big one. This is a guy who has never played a 60-minute football game as much as he's in Nick Savage's strength and conditioning program. You don't know how he's going to respond, how that accuracy may wane when he's out there throwing consistently and taking hits. We don't know those things. So certainly one could say if everything goes right, Florida may have a better chance and Tennessee's chances are less because Florida has a more accurate quarterback, less turnover prone, and one who's smarter in terms of delivering the football. But I don't know. I don't want to buy into that too much. There are certainly some troubles that Kyle Trask is going to run into and Emory Jones could run into. We just don't really know what those are yet. And that's one of those remains to be seen things. There's a reason everyone talks about, backup quarterbacks so highly, being one of the most favored men on campus, because, none of their mistakes are held against them. They're not magnified. Some of those things are going to happen on Saturday. Kyle Trask is going to miss some receivers downfield. Some of his passes are going to land short. Those things are going to happen, and people are going to hold those against him and remember him. And he will be no longer this, great-looking quarterback. He's going to be picked apart, and we're going to see what those flaws are. And Tennessee, unfortunately for them, they aren't really going to be able to go into that game knowing what those flaws are and able to zero in on or feeling like they're going to be able to maximize anyone's mistakes. But they're also, again, going to be facing pretty much a rookie quarterback that, even though he had that fourth quarter in Kentucky, there are going to be some things that Kyle Trask is going to have to struggle with and going to have to adjust to if Florida's going to be successful.
Graham, how much do we see Emory Jones on Saturday? Because that's a point too that we made in the podcast earlier this week, and also I made on an appearance on a Florida podcast actually earlier today. To me, I think Emory Jones, as you mentioned, they've tried to kind of rework his entire passing, the way he throws and everything. But he's a very good athlete. He's a really good runner, and he has potential as a thrower. But with this being Trask's first start at quarterback, since early high school, I mean, he wasn't even the starting quarterback for his high school team in his senior year. I don't think he was in his junior year either. So this being his first start in a very long time at quarterback, I mean, do you think it could prove to be very disruptive to him to have him in there for a few series and then suddenly Emory Jones comes in for a play or two and then they take him out? Because I look at what Georgia did last season, and I remember watching, in the Tennessee game, you saw that offense not clicking on all cylinders most of the time because you would have Jake Fromm in there, and then all of a sudden they would put in Justin Fields, and that to me was one of the reasons why Georgia, didn't win nearly as handily against Tennessee in Athens last year as I thought they were going to, because, well, for one, Tennessee was able to force some turnovers, but for two, the quarterback situation ended up being kind of a, not really a revolving door, but it kind of would bring Jake Fromm out of his rhythm sometimes. So I'm curious, in your opinion, how much do you think we see Emory Jones, and then do you think that, what exactly are you wanting to see from him when he's out there, and what do you want to see from Florida's offense? Yeah, that's a really good point. Dan Mullen has kind of taken even some shots at the whole Justin Fields Georgia situation, as you're kind of aware, and has kind of talked about the mindset behind playing a young quarterback or bringing in a backup quarterback. You have to find the right reasons to do it. You can't just get this 4-star, 5-star quarterback in the game because you're worried about them leaving, and then you end up doing what Georgia did last year, is then you don't use the quarterback the right way, or you're so clearly creating a situation out of nothing and disrupting the whole offensive flow because you look like you're tailoring your whole coaching around the demands of one guy. That is such a difficult thing to deal with, and I think that Kirby Smart found that out the hard way, and of course other coaches have found that out the hard way. For Dan Mullen, the thing is finding a way to maximize Emory Jones' skill set, and what that really means and how it could matter against Tennessee is it matters what Tennessee's defense is giving Kyle Trask. Obviously, if Kyle Trask comes out and has some early turnovers, looks rattled, Florida's really going to look at Emory Jones and see what he could give them. But if Kyle Trask is struggling with his accuracy as well, and Tennessee's dropping 8, or they're somehow able to get pressure with 3 guys and Florida's not able to establish the run, I could easily see Dan Mullen just looking at Emory Jones for an extended period of time. That is something that he's going to have to decide. This is really where the most intriguing matchup is. It's not the quarterback battle or the offensive line and the defensive line, although ultimately those things are going to be what decides the game. It's really Jeremy Pruitt against Dan Mullen. Dan Mullen has to find a way to exploit what Jeremy Pruitt's going to try and do, and Jeremy Pruitt's going to try and find a way to rattle what Dan Mullen's going to do offensively. Really, it's two guys that are getting a fresh start in a sense. Jeremy Pruitt has never seen a Dan Mullen offense with a fresh quarterback, especially a more pro-style quarterback like Kyle Trask, in kind of a spread system that Dan Mullen likes to run. And Mullen doesn't really know what Jeremy Pruitt's going to do against this quarterback because it's so hard to game plan for him. It's very intriguing, that aspect to me. I don't know how it's going to go down. My gut tells me right now that we're going to end up seeing more Emory Jones than people think, and that's because I think Jeremy Pruitt is going to try and force Kyle Trask into making some throws that he thinks he has but really doesn't have. I think you're going to see some corner blitzes while guys drop into coverage to try and force Trask into some bad throws, and then Jeremy Pruitt's going to want to rattle Dan Mullen to putting in Emory Jones too early. We'll see if that happens. I'm very intrigued what happens defensively for the Vols and what Florida ends up doing at quarterback throughout the entire 60 minutes. On the injury front, obviously you have Felipe Franks out for the season. You have Kadarius Toney, who's going to be out for a few more weeks. So those are two guys who are, for sure not going to play this weekend against Tennessee. But you have a few other guys, whether it's C.J. Henderson or Zuniga, who are kind of been banged up. Is there any type of it's been a few days since Mullen talked on Monday about some of those guys. Is there any kind of update on some of the banged up Gators? I don't have all the list in front of me of all the guys who were hurt, but you also have I know Steiner, who's going to be out for the first half. What are who are some of the guys who are questionable? Who are some of the guys who are going to be out? Who are some of the guys you think will play against Tennessee who've been kind of banged up here the last week or so?
Yeah, when it comes to safety for Florida, you mentioned Donovan Steiner going to have to serve that first half suspension because he got a targeting call in the third quarter against the Wildcats. That's such a weird rule that I think a lot of people missed that one in the aftermath, and especially with everything that happened in Florida, that Florida would be out another safety, a guy who is, splitting reps with the first team safety, Sean Davis. Brad Stewart just had his first return back as well, and then Jawan Taylor has been in the red no contact jersey off and on in Florida practice throughout. So that is certainly a position to watch, although you look at what Sean Davis did against the Wildcats, 2 interceptions, and graded really, really highly. So certainly that's a position to watch. If Sean has to leave the game at any point, I would expect Tennessee to take some shots. When it comes to Jabari Zuniga, that's a guy who left in the first quarter against the Wildcats. I would expect him to play. I don't know how much he will play. I think that'll be something the game dictates. He really, really wants to play. Obviously, a senior, but when you look at Florida's defensive line, that's a position that they can kind of rest some guys. They got John Greenard in there from Louisville as the transfer, who's had really a good start to the season. They've got really young guys in Zach Carter and Andrew Chatfield that they're really, really high on. If anything, they need a guy like Zach Carter to play inside at defensive tackle due to some of the depth issues there. Kyrie Campbell, one to watch as well. His health has been kind of off and on. And then the big question mark, obviously, in terms of guys that may be a game time decision is C.J. Henderson. You saw Florida's starting cornerback, projected by many to be a first-round pick in the upcoming NFL draft. He left that game. He missed the game, against Kentucky. He tried to play against Kentucky. He did travel with the team, part of the 70 men who traveled to Lexington. He wanted to play at game time, but didn't go through warm-ups. He's been practicing, although he's not going fully 100% in practice, but I would expect him to play as well. That's a guy who doesn't want to miss anything. I think it could be a similar situation to Jabari Zuniga, where if Florida does have a big lead by chance in the second half, they try and get some of those younger guys in for meaningful reps, which is something Dan Mullen has talked about a lot, and the value of that and getting them in the right situations, not just garbage time, to get them some meaningful reps. So that's certainly 2 things to monitor. Another one, Ventrell Miller, one of Florida's linebackers who's filling in there for Voshawn Joseph, who's with the Buffalo Bills. Ventrell Miller was also in the red no contact jersey yesterday. I'm not sure what his injury is, but I asked someone in the program. They do expect him to play. Again, it's going to be kind of probably in more of a limited capacity, and they're going to try and get some of those other younger linebackers in there, like James Houston and LaCedric Brunson. So Florida's certainly banged up on defense, and we didn't even mention the 2 critical guys they're missing on offense. Well, obviously we mentioned Felipe Franks, but Kadarius Toney, a guy that's going to be out probably for the entire season for Florida. When you factor in losing Felipe Franks and Kadarius Toney, I would expect this to be a little more of a traditional type of offense from the Gators. I would expect them, if they do run some trick plays, it's going to be some guys that we haven't really seen, and that it's going to be interesting how Dan Mullen disguises those things, because no one really expects, Freddie Swain to take end arounds or Josh Hammond to be run the jet sweep, although he certainly showed against the Wildcats that he can take it 76 yards to the house. Florida's going to have to get creative with some of their skill position guys, because they are certainly banged up heading into this game against Tennessee.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you made there about kind of their offensive philosophy, because my next question was actually about that offensive line, because Tennessee's offensive line, to me, still not anywhere close where it needs to be. They showed a lot of improvement against UTC, but again, that's against Chattanooga. They should hopefully show improvement, but you've seen some of these younger guys like Wanya Morris, Darnell Wright, K'Ron Calvert, these guys who haven't played at all or much at all for Tennessee. They've grown, and they're still kind of improving week by week. Florida's offensive line, for what I've seen, I don't have the stats in front of me. I know both running games have been very similar in their production, as far as I think Florida's averaging something like 4.5 yards per carry, Tennessee something like 4.4. But also you've got a couple of those, as you mentioned, those reverses, end arounds, whatever you want to call it, that have maybe kind of padded the stats just a little bit for Florida. What kind of confidence do you have? And to me, Tennessee's defensive front seven isn't great. So what kind of confidence do you have in Florida's offensive line? And now that you mentioned you don't have a Kadarius Toney, you don't have a Felipe Franks, they're going to kind of have to change what they do. What kind of confidence do you have in Florida's offensive line? Maybe not even just in this game, but kind of moving forward, because it's a different task they're having to do, protecting for a different type of quarterback.
Well, I think that Florida's offensive line is going to be very similar to last year, where through game reps they are going to improve as the year goes on. Obviously, though, when you're playing a lot of action and you're practicing, you can open yourself up to getting hurt a little bit more. And when you think of the 5 guys that Florida has been going with at their starting line, these guys have gotten a lot of reps when you factor in the spring and all of fall camp as this rotation. John DeLance, the right tackle, did kind of struggle against the Wildcats. I shouldn't even say kind of. He did struggle, although not all of it is because of talent reasons. That's a guy who almost didn't play against Miami, has really been around 70-80% for much of the season, dealing with a nagging lower foot injury. I don't know how healthy he really is, but it's clear that this is a unit that's going to have to get makeshift and deal with some bumps and bruises, as John Hevesy said last night, throughout the rest of the season. And it could factor in to some rotating some young guys in there. You saw against the Wildcats when DeLance was struggling, they moved left tackle Stone Forsythe over to right tackle and brought in redshirt freshman Richard Garage at left tackle. We talked to John Hevesy on Tuesday night, asked him the philosophy behind that. He said simply it's that Stone has played both positions and Richard can play left tackle better. So really you could have a guy at left tackle who has never started a game, and Richard Garage has only played in 5 games against the Volunteers. So when you look at that, if that is a situation that occurs, if due to injuries, you'd be looking at 3 redshirt freshmen on Florida's offensive line at one time. That certainly is something to watch and could lead to Tennessee's front seven looking much better than previously advertised. You saw Dan Mullen on the SEC teleconference on Wednesday coming out and saying, this is a Tennessee team that we can't take lightly. We don't know how good or how bad they may be. I mean, you can't really take away too much from that BYU game after seeing what they did to USC. Obviously a bad first loss, but that happens. Mistakes happen to every single team. Tennessee is just as capable of Florida is as improving throughout the season. So Florida is going to have to monitor that. They can't go in thinking that they're going to be able to establish the run easily against Tennessee's front seven, or that this is the game that LaMichael Pirine gets going. They can't have that mindset. If you really look at Florida's first 3 games and you look at how those games went, I think there's a pretty easy explanation for why the running game hasn't got going. That Miami game was pretty weird. Florida only ran, I think, 54 plays on offense, and the running plays that they did try and establish, that may be one of the best front sevens that Florida plays all year in Miami. That game, again, a new offensive line. And then you look at UT Martin. Florida really didn't run the ball too much, although they had, I think, 230-plus rushing yards. And then again against Kentucky, when you're down by double digits like Florida was there in the third quarter, you don't really want to be establishing the run. I think that this is a rushing attack by Florida that's going to end up being fine, but they certainly have their work cut out for them, and by no means can they go into this game on Saturday thinking that they're going to run for 200 yards against a talented front seven led by Jeremy Pruitt.
Yeah, really quickly here, because I want to get to a couple other things, but you mentioned Michael Pirine. I watched all of Mullen's press conference on Monday, and he was asked about Pirine. He kind of, he didn't really give an answer. He kind of brushed off a little bit and kind of gave, kind of a typical coach's answer. What, in your opinion, has kept Pirine from, as you said, kind of, turning on and being the type of running back that people thought he could be? Because I look at what he did last year, and he was more than just a serviceable back. He was a pretty productive running back for Florida this year, but he's been, obviously, in that entire rushing attack has just not been, great for Florida this year. What do you think is the issue with Pirine right now?
I think it is a combination. I think, like I said, it's how those games have went. Florida hasn't really had a chance to establish the run in situations that where the run could really capitalize on what the defense was giving them. Then obviously the other one is the offensive line. I think that when you look at the run blocking, it leaves much to be desired. That certainly could change as the season goes on, but Florida really is not blocking well enough to create the holes that LaMichael Pirine needs. I mean, no offense to LaMichael Pirine, he doesn't have top flight speed. I mean, certainly he has great speed, but if that hole is not there, sometimes he's just not going to go anywhere. He's not really the most, I don't want to say he's not the most dynamic runner, because that's not a fair term. But this offensive line has not really been conducive to his strengths, is the other big reason. And there's also, I think that you have to put a little bit of blame on him, and certainly he would agree with that. He's not going to say he's blameless at all. I think if anything, he's been a little overly ambitious. When I go back and watch, I think that he's looking too long for the right hole or for the big play, rather than just taking 3-4 yards and calling it a day and calling it a gain. He's dancing around a little bit too much, or trying to hope for that hole to be there rather than just running behind the tackles. I don't know if really, I'm not a coach. I can't say if that's definitively it, but when I sit there and watch, I think that he's just being a little bit overly eager. He needs just to relax, and hopefully those holes will establish, and he'll get a big run, and we'll all look back and say, this is kind of funny. LaMichael Pirine clearly has a lot of talent. And the other point that you made about Dan Mullen bringing up LaMichael Pirine in a way that he kind of did defect, it shows how he is an all-around back. He is second on Florida's team in receiving, in receptions, excuse me. So that is certainly another strength. He's finding other ways to be productive, even if it's not on the ground game.
Graham, looking at this game, it's going to be a noon kickoff. It's going to be, that's, to me, if you're a road team looking for an upset, that's kind of what you want, especially if you're a road underdog. Tennessee last year went down to Auburn at noon kickoff and did pull off that upset, and Tennessee's had multiple noon kickoffs in Neyland where they've kind of sleptwalked and they let the inferior opponent kind of hang around longer than they should have. In your opinion, what are your expectations for the crowd in the Swamp, and what are your expectations for kind of the atmosphere? Do you think the noon kickoff is going to have kind of make a muted effect for the Swamp? Because from what I remember, I don't remember the last time this game was a noon kickoff in Gainesville, because I know in 2014 it was a noon kickoff in Knoxville, but I don't remember the last time it was in Gainesville. So what are kind of your expectations for the crowd and the atmosphere for the game?
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I unfortunately, for college football lovers out there, I think that this is going to be kind of one of the worst attended Florida Tennessee games probably in history. You factor in it being a noon kickoff in September. It's going to be extremely hot. Florida's already sent out multiple notices about making sure people are hydrated throughout the game. You factor in that people are also thinking if they're ever going to skip a Florida-Tennessee matchup, this is probably the one to sit at home and watch. It's not like, the glory days by any means, unfortunately, although it is going to be a good football game. I think that many people are kind of tuning out of this one. Many people have labeled Tennessee and kind of written them off prematurely, even though you think recently to some of the crazy finishes in the game. You and I were talking about Felipe Franks being out and how Tennessee fans may be a little bit, thinking that their chances have gone down, but a lot of people thinking about that Felipe Franks, heave to Tyree Cleveland that broke all the Tennessee fans' hearts years ago. So certainly this is a game that recently has been very exciting. But I'm right there with you. The noon, the combination of a new quarterback for Florida, it being Tennessee kind of a down year, I think this could be a 70,000 attended game, and we'll see if any of those teams are affected by it. I know that Florida has at times followed or gone with how the crowd has gone, and if the crowd isn't there at the beginning of the game, they really aren't either. So that'll certainly be something to watch Saturday.
Despite, I wouldn't say a rough start. Tennessee's had a rough start. Florida hasn't had a rough start, but they obviously had to come from behind both against Miami and against Kentucky. Despite kind of those, having to come from behind victories, they've stayed in the top 10. They're still number 9 in the AP poll. They're number 8 in the coaches poll. In your opinion, Graham, in the 3 games you've seen Florida play this season, is Florida a top 10 team? Do you think they are overrated? Do you think they're rated properly? What is your opinion on this team so far?
That's a good question. I don't want to say that they're not a top 10 team, but I don't think that we can sit here right now and say that they are. And I know that answer may be a cop-out in a sense, but I don't think that we've really had a chance after just 3 games to really see how good or how bad Florida really could be. They've been dealing with a lot of injuries. They've been dealing with an offensive line that's still in flux. They now have a new quarterback that you and I were just talking about could end up giving Florida's offense, taking them to new heights. in this year alone. There's still 9 games left to be played. Florida hasn't established the ground game. This team could look wildly different in 6 weeks, or they could look very similar. I don't want to sit here and write them off. But if Kyle Trask is able to establish a passing game for Florida, if the defense heals up and stays injury free for the rest of the season, Florida certainly has the pieces to just suffer 2 losses or stay in the mix of the SEC East throughout the entire season, depending on how Georgia ends up and some of these other games turn out. I don't want to say that, but certainly there are a lot of issues right now for Florida to correct, but all of them seem manageable. All of them, it's not like they're losing. They're short at any position. If they lose key guys at certain positions, then they're in a lot of trouble. But as things are right now, they still have a chance at an uptick. We'll see if Saturday is a step in the right direction. Certainly, if you're Dan Mullen, you want to keep getting things cleaned up every single week, because once you hit October and you have Auburn, Georgia, LSU, there's no more chances to say, okay, maybe we'll establish it this game, or maybe we'll get things cleaned up. Because if you aren't ready to go by October 5th on homecoming when Auburn comes in, it's gonna be do or die starting with that game.
Graham, just a couple more questions for you here, and I, again, appreciate you taking time every day to do this with me. But looking at, as I mentioned, I think there are ingredients there for Tennessee to pull off this upset. You have, to me, Jarrett Garantano, statistically and from watching just with my own 2 eyes, he plays better on the road. You do have a Tennessee team that, they don't have anything to lose. they've gotten off to a really bad start. Yeah, I guess you have something to lose in the fact that this could be a historically bad season, but you're kind of with house money at this point. You're not expected to get out and win this game. With Florida still, they have a brand new quarterback. They just lost their quarterback for the season, and they're still a 2-touchdown favorite in this game. Like I said, the new kickoff too, I think, could help Tennessee pull this upset. I think there are ingredients there. I'm not willing to go ahead and make the prediction that Tennessee is going to win, but I'm curious in your thoughts, Graham, from someone who covers Florida. What are your thoughts on Tennessee's chances of pulling off the upset and getting into Gainesville and getting that first victory in the Swamp since 2003?
Yeah, I certainly think that Tennessee will come in looking to play aggressive, loose, with a chip on their shoulders. Like you said, Garantano is a guy who does seem to play well on the road. I think that Tennessee is going to give a lot of fight. I have no question about that. I certainly don't know. I don't want to say they're overmatched, but I think from a coaching perspective, you have to give Dan Mullen the nod here. Every game really that he's coached at Florida, he's come out in the second half and made adjustments that have helped Florida stay in those games. They really have been in every single game down to the very end. And I think you have to give him most of the credit, regardless of the personnel. He's one of the main factors behind that. And I think that ultimately will be what decides the game. I think even if Tennessee does come out and gets an early lead, I think that Florida does have enough to make it a game late in the second half. I certainly hope that we have a really enthralling match in Gainesville on Saturday, but I think that Florida does get it done. I think that they do get the run game established. I'm interested to see how that game does go. If Kyle Trask does get rattled, though, everything I said, if he gets rattled and Emory Jones does come in and has to be the leader of the team and lead Florida down for some reason, that could be a game that goes either way, certainly. There are some ways that Florida could be in some dire straits on Saturday, and if I'm Tennessee, I'm looking to exploit those early. I'm very interested to see what Jeremy Pruitt does on defense and how he looks to take advantage of a very, very inexperienced quarterback who, based on sample size, shows a lot of promise, but we both know that there's a lot of things that go into it for the full 60 minutes. So I'm certainly interested to see how those things go. On paper, it looks like Florida could win by double digits, but there's a lot of reasons that this could go in Tennessee's favor, and I think that kind of sums up why we love college football.
Last question here for you, Graham. It could be positive, it could be negative, but what has been, through 3 games so far, watching the Gators, what's been your biggest surprise for this team? Has there been something you thought they would do well that they haven't done well? Has there been something that they haven't done well that they're the other way around, that they have done well that you didn't think would be a strength of this team? What's been the biggest surprise for you with this team so far?
I would actually say the corners. The cornerbacks have, I think, been disappointing to me so far. And that's not really an indictment of, I think, them overall. I think that certainly you look at Florida's cornerback situation, certainly two of the most talented guys in all of college football. But last week, Marco Wilson with C.J. Henderson out. Marco did kind of struggle, and a lot of that was because he was covering a guy who was 6'9". He was still in good position, but after 2 ACL tears, we do wonder if he's lost some of that verticality that made him make up for what he did lack with some of his size. I think that he's certainly a very, very talented defensive back, but people may be asking questions if his play continues in the way that it has. Trey Dean also, that's a guy that a lot of people I don't think have been talking about. He was expected to make a huge leap in his sophomore year, and right now he's on path for a kind of a sophomore slump. That's a guy that Florida really hasn't started to trust working at inside corner. They weren't really able to use him there when C.J. Henderson was out against the Wildcats, so Florida was playing a freshman at times. I don't know if that unit will improve, and then obviously the health of C.J. Henderson is the last factor. Will he be able to return? And if that ankle sprain ends up limiting his mobility for the rest of the season, we don't know. That is certainly something to watch. But that is, if I had been asked a month ago what would have been the most disappointing aspect, I don't think I would have picked the secondary. If anything, Sean Davis has saved me from saying the secondary as a whole, because right now Florida's secondary certainly been disappointing outside of Sean Davis right now.
Well, Graham, you've been great. I think have given our listeners here a really good breakdown of the Gators, and I wonder if our listeners here feel more or less confident in Tennessee's chances of winning after listening to you. I think I'm still about the same where I was. I've done my homework, done research. I knew a decent amount what you're saying there, but I was surprised by a couple of things, but I still feel about the same way I do heading into our conversation. That is that, I personally am not expecting Tennessee to pull off the upset, but again, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast here. Let our listeners know if they want to, follow along with Gator information heading into the game, even after the game, and keep up with the Gators during the season. Where can they find your work? Where can they follow you?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me on. It's always my pleasure to be here, talk all things Gators and Tennessee with you. Hope to be back in the future. Anyone out there who wants some Gators content or coverage of Saturday's game, along with Nathaniel, who does a great job on social media, you can follow me on Twitter at @GrahamHall_. And you can read my work at Gatorsports.com. Although if you want the gist, we just put up a paywall. Don't tell them I said that. You can read me on Twitter. So it's always my pleasure to be here. And if you're traveling south for the game on Saturday, please drive safe and take care out there. And Nathaniel, hope to be back and talk with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.